over as president because Nixon resigns. Nixon would probably have went through an impeachment proceeding and would have been voted to be removed from office. He's the only president we've ever had to resign, so he does this on his own accord. Gerald Ford, because he is now the president, he has the ability to pardon Nixon, which he does, and he will receive massive backlash from this. Because of the pardon, a lot of Americans felt like Nixon should be further punished for what he did. However, Nixon is removed, he is pardoned, and Gerald Ford, because of that, is not able to do a whole lot as president. Gerald Ford is the only president in history to never have gone through an election cycle. Nixon actually had another guy that was his vice president that was on the ticket with him in 72. And he actually was nothing to do with the Watergate scandal. He ends up getting thrown in jail for tax evasion. And then Nixon has a vacancy in the vice presidency, and he is able to appoint a person to the vice presidency. And the person he appointed was Ford. So Ford's name never really appeared or never appeared on a ballot. He only was, put in by appointment, which is kind of interesting. So let's fast forward. Gerald Ford runs against Jimmy Carter, and Carter ends up winning this election. That would have been the 76 election. Carter wins. However, Carter's got some problems. Carter's administration was unable to fix economic problems. At the time, the government or the economics in the United States were not good. We had an oil embargo that had taken place. The Middle Eastern countries had refused to send oil here because we had supported Israel in some conflicts. And so there was a gas shortage in the United States at this time. If you're a car person and you ever wondered why cars go from, these metal, American steel, really heavy gas guzzlers in the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s a little bit, to these very light cars that, very plasticky in the 80s, this is why. Because gas prices had increased significantly during the time. I want to say gas was doubling and tripling. And I'm trying to remember, my dad talked about when gas was a quarter when he was young. When he worked at a gas station, it was a big deal if somebody came in and said, fill up, the whole tank, because people just didn't travel as far and the cars weren't fuel efficient. However, gas wasn't real expensive. However, under Carter's administration, it tripled. Now, if you think about it, if it was a quarter a gallon and it triples, it's going to be around $1, in that realm. And now you're like, oh, that might sound really good, especially probably you guys remember when gas was almost $4. But during the time, minimum wage wasn't that high. So you have to look at kind of relative prices. Minimum wage at this point was about $2.10. And so for gas to increase that much, you were going to be spending, almost your entire paycheck to fill up your car, which is a pretty big deal if you're a teenager, working, 25 hours a week, let's say, and going to school. So this causes a problem. In addition to this, we have double-digit inflation. So not only is gas going up, but everything else is going up in price. And on top of that, make this even worse. The unemployment rate is incredibly high. So prices are going up and people aren't working. That's a problem. So this starts to erode that middle-class prosperity that people had in the 1950s. Remember, we talked about buying cars and houses and spending all this money, new washing machines, new vacuum cleaners, televisions. Americans can't do that anymore. Life has changed in the 70s. In addition to that, Carter's administration also has a foreign problem, and that is that in Iran, they have had a hostage crisis that has taken place. That is from the movie Argo, and it's a good movie. It's not super historically accurate when it comes to the Iranian hostage crisis. But basically what ends up happening is that crowd that's protesting the fact that the Americans have given asylum or welcomed in the Shah, which was the king of Iran, who was very, very brutal. The Iranian protesters go in and they actually seize the American embassy. And they take the Americans that are there hostage, and they hold them for over a year. This ends up causing Carter to lose re-election of the presidency. And it's interesting that the hostages are released the day that Ronald Reagan takes the oath of office, and is inaugurated. So let's talk a little bit about Reagan. So Ronald Reagan is elected in the 80s. There's concerns about the economy, Americans weakening as a global power. He is very patriotic. He has this very much can-do attitude. He was known for telling jokes. His speeches are actually pretty interesting. If you can actually go back and YouTube Reagan jokes during his speeches, he opened a lot of times with just something to make people laugh. He had been an actor prior to. My grandma actually saw movies that he was in back in the day. And he wanted for a social and economic change. There were a lot of Americans that voted for him because they wanted this change to happen. Like I said before, the Iranian hostages are released on his inauguration day, which does bolster support for him. So let's talk a little bit about his economic theory. He believed in something known as Reaganomics or supply-side economics, which is where you cut taxes to the wealthy to encourage them to invest and create jobs. So if the idea was if you give more money to the rich people, they'll create jobs for the middle classes and so forth. It trickles down. He believed that they should cut government spending on social programs. He closes, for example, he closes state-run asylums or government-run asylums. He cuts funding to particular areas, that the government had been responsible for. Like we said, this idea is referred to as the trickle-down theory, so that if you give the money, put the money in the hands of the wealthy, they'll invest it and get it then into the hands of the poor. Conservatives that are fiscally conservative, meaning conservative when it comes to money, believed Reaganomics was this, American savior. There's some problems, and you can see from the picture at the top, it's not going to trickle down quite the way that they see fit. On the other side, liberals said that America's economic well-being depended on the ability of all people to use or consume goods. In other words, you sell more if everybody can afford it. So if you increase the dollar amount that people are making, whether you increase minimum wage or you end up, making the wealthy pay taxes, but yet they're, still able to supply these jobs, then that's going to be more beneficial. So this is kind of the opposite perspective, or is the opposite perspective of Reaganomics or supply side. It's called demand side economics. Like we said, the increased demand will prompt businesses to produce more, and therefore they'll hire workers. The wealthy should pay more taxes, and tax cuts should be for the middle and lower classes who use that money to consume more goods. The idea is that extra spending will lead to more investment, jobs, and economic prosperity. This is a great example of what's happening now. We are living in some demand side economics. Your families, because of the hard times, hopefully, depending on their income, have made or received a check of, $1,200 plus because they have you from the government. And that money, hopefully by putting money into the hands of people, the idea is that Americans will spend that, and that will help stimulate the economy. This was also done by George W. Bush in 2008 as the recession was hitting. I think, I know I received, if I remember back, $400, and I didn't save a dime of that. I spent all of it just because I had extra money in my pocket. Don't recommend that. I encourage you to save that money if it comes in, but some families can't afford to do that. It's encouraged that they, spend it on rent or spend it on food, whatever they need to spend that money on, since a lot aren't working. So the economic role of government, let's talk for a little bit about liberal versus conservative. Liberals argue that the government should stimulate the economy during hard times through deficit spending, so spending money that's borrowed, spending money that they don't have. Conservatives believe that the government should balance the budget and reduce spending. I would argue that's changed a little bit, because conservatives are in favor of spending money on defense. So even though they don't want the government to spend money on people, the conservatives or Republicans now tend to spend more money when it comes to defense. So we've kind of shifted when it comes to political parties and kind of where their stance on this. Deregulation, meaning taking the government out of things. The Reagan administration limited enforcement of regulation on businesses and banks. This was supported by economic conservatives who viewed regulation as an economic constraint. Liberals supported regulations and said it was a means to help consumers. We're going to protect people, by having these in place. Also, the conservatives wanted to limit the enforcement of environmental protections, and basically looked at pollution non-existent. These are people that say the planet's fine, we don't need to conserve. Gas guzzling cars are fine, those kinds of things. Or they say global warming's fake. That tends to be, the conservative viewpoint when it comes to the environment. Liberals argued that we can have jobs and protect the environment at the same time. Sorry, I went the wrong way. Reagan's stance, he took a really hard line against communism and the Soviet Union. He increases defense spending, and actually there's some debate about this, but he basically spends more money than the Soviets can keep up with, which ends up resulting in the Soviet Union dissolving. They can't spend as much as we do. The meme you see on the top right is Reagan at the Brandenburg Gate giving the famous, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, tear down the Berlin Wall speech. They give Reagan credit for, conservatives give Reagan credit for ending the Cold War. Liberals say the fall of the Soviet Union is for economic and social problems that were happening in leadership. They had, new leaders that came in that were a little different than, the Stalins, the Khrushchevs that had been in power. So let's talk about some long-term effects. Reaganomics, defense spending, and globalization impacted the economics of the United States. It changes our economy and how we run things here. Also, you have some budget deficits that triple our national debt. We end up spending more money than is coming in. Deregulated business does lead to massive bailouts that add to the debt. And then keep in mind that neither conservatives or liberals addressed outsourcing of manufacturing jobs. And this will continue into the 90s. Bill Clinton doesn't help with this either. Manufacturing jobs start going overseas. My hometown is a great example of this. When my dad graduated high school, everybody went into the plants to work for the most part. Some went to college, but most went into factories. Those factories now are all closed and don't exist. It's because they've been outsourced. The things that they made are now produced in China or other countries where they can pay workers less money than they would have to pay them here in the U.S. So most new jobs that came about are low paying and resulted in low tax revenues. That's part of the argument to increase minimum wage, because the jobs that have been created have been minimum wage service jobs that don't pay a whole lot. It used to be that you could graduate high school with a diploma and, go get a factory job and make, up to $40 an hour, at the end. Those jobs really don't exist anymore. So the gap between the rich and the poor continues to rise and increase. Reagan also successfully connected conservatism to economic growth and traditional values, and liberalism to wasteful spending and huge government. That's our perspectives now when you look at the political parties. So Republicans connected, the Republicans do good with economic growth, and also, this idea of traditional values, whereas liberals, the opposite perspective, they are wasteful in spending and this huge government controls too much. Liberals will counter this image. They portray themselves as champions of the middle class, and they also claim that it's the government's job to protect the middle class, and you'll hear that when we look at candidates running, in this next election. You hear Bernie Sanders talking about, or when he was running, you heard him talking about, I'm going to help the middle class. I'm going to do these things to help the middle class. The Democrats portray themselves in that way. Joe Biden does this too. I would argue Bernie probably has been more outspoken when he was running. You will hear Biden do this against Donald Trump in the debates as we go forward. Donald Trump, same thing. He'll talk about how the government's wasteful, big government, huge government. We don't want that. We want the government out of our business. They kind of take up these positions, and this is where they stand. So hopefully this is interesting. Hopefully it helps you guys determine, maybe what you want to do or what you want to do with your vote in the future. Kind of thinking about things. It's kind of interesting. I don't want to persuade you one way or another. It's up to you. But these are where the two sides, or where the two sides lie at this current moment. So have a great day, and we'll see you next time.